There's no doubt in my mind that Venerable Bede is the father of English history, and his work is so important and has been a great inspiration to me in learning about English history. However, what we're going to discuss today is the potential biases and things we need to be cautious of when studying history as a whole, but focusing on Bede's work, primarily the ecclesiastical history of the English people. So first and foremost, Bede lived at the turn of the 8th century, born in 673 and passing away in 735. So already we're looking through someone else's cultural lens from 1,300 years ago. Bede was only about 7 years old when he was offered to Benedict's bishop at Weymouth Monastery, and only a couple of years later he was sent to the neighbouring monastery, Jarrow, with Abbot Ceolfrith, where he would spend the remainder of his life. We know that Bede travelled to Lindisfarne, Hexham and York, but that's still within the same kingdom, that's Northumbria. So not only are we dealing with a guy who is looking at the world through a monastic lens, but very specifically a Northumbrian monastic lens. And Jarrow probably housed up to 200 monks, so it's not as if he was living in isolation and could never bounce ideas or learn off other people, but he was around people who were living the same life as him, so his scope of society is already quite limited. However, the monastery he was at, Jarrow, was well known for being an excellent place of scholarship. Benedict's bishop and Abbot Ceolfrith had access to some scholarly texts from countries like France and Italy. So naturally, Bede had access to these as well, meaning that his education wasn't necessarily limited. He clearly did have an understanding of the outside world. But then again, that is through a scholarly lens and written by people who could write, which was usually, other monks or people of the elite class. And that being said, when he was putting out works of his own, he had the reputation of his monastery to live up to. And that would naturally play a role in the way you present information. So already we're starting to see how natural biases could bleed into the work that you're putting out there, which is normal for every human who's ever lived. And we can't expect Bede to know that his work would go on to be so important and so central to our understanding of Anglo-Saxon England. But now that is the case, I think it's important for us to be cautious of the potential biases and prejudices that naturally would have came into his works. Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people, for example, was written for a particular audience, and that audience was King Ceolwulf of Northumbria. Now, it seems as though King Ceolwulf had an inclination for history and the church, so we might be able to infer that Bede would do his due diligence and do his best to use the resources that he has available, tradition, word of mouth, the people that he meets, the library and documentary evidence that he has available to him to get to the truth the best way possible, because he's passing it on to someone who has a real keen interest in the topic. And I think how brilliant ecclesiastical history of the English people is, and how much accuracy there is in there and how detailed it is a reflection that it is a work of genuine passion and genuine interest. But there are seemingly errors in ecclesiastical history of the English people. For example, the Anglo-Saxon migration is described as quite a bloody affair, whereas archaeological evidence shows that Romano-British people and Anglo-Saxons lived side by side. They exchanged culture to a degree. They were buried near each other. And DNA evidence seems to suggest that they intermarried and interbred with each other. Now, it's likely that Bede got his information regarding the Anglo-Saxon migration from Gildas, who was a Welsh monk who lived during a time when Anglo-Saxons were majority pagan, so he had quite a negative opinion of them, and that might have played a role in why he highlighted any violent affairs that went on, which they may well have done. They may well have been bands who raided a village and took it, whereas another group of people might have just settled in a local area. But because of his cultural bias, he has decided to focus on the bloody affair of it. And then well over a century later, Bede has used somebody else's culturally biased opinion to form one of his own works. Another example of how Bede might show his bias is how he sort of frames the generations that preceded him to be sort of a golden age of Christianity. Now, I think this is something that transcends time, because even us today can relate to thinking the past was better. For me, it comes to like comedy TV shows. I often rewatch things like The Office or Only Fools and Horses because I think it's better than the stuff that's made recently. And also with football as well, which is another interest of mine. I feel like it was more skillful and passionate back in the day than it is now. But these are just subjective opinions. And I think that's something that we can all relate to. When we apply that to Christianity as a whole, you look at heroes from the Old Testament all the way up to Paul the Apostle. They struggled with sin and doubt and worry and things like that. Paul even said himself, the good I want to do, I do not, and the evil I do not want to do is what I keep on doing, or something like that. And I think we can apply that to the entirety of Christendom across space and time. I would never go as far as to suggest one generation was more sinful than another. So the point of this video is not to bash Bede. He's a genuine inspiration of mine. But I've been using a lot of his texts to do some research for future videos that I'm working on. And I became kind of fascinated by the cultural and regional lens that he was seeing the world through. And as historians, our job is to be detectives of the past, just as Bede was. He did what he could with the resources he has available to him. And us as modern historians have some advantages in the way that we can test DNA and the kind of things we can do with archaeology these days, like scanning the ground without invasively digging through it. And it certainly is an advantage that we have that Bede did not. And then us as historians have to sort of agree that we suffer from the same thing as well. For example, when reading about the miracles that Bede recorded, I, for example, as a Christian, am inclined to believe that these may well have happened, whereas I couldn't blame an atheist historian for discounting them. I think the one thing we can agree on is that we both want to find out the truth, and we can look at why these were perceived as miracles, what was the profound effect on the society around them. The sad truth at the end of the day is that we probably will never know unless we can get a time machine and an invisible cloak to make sure we don't disturb any of the events. But that's something that's so beautiful about history, is that we can always keep on digging. There's always going to be mysteries. And even though we will never have a finite answer to everything, we also have unlimited soil to dig through. So I just wanted to make this little video. I've had a chatty video like this before when I talked about monasteries, but it's not my usual style. But I like just sitting in front of the camera and chatting about something I've been thinking about. Because as I said, I'm using a lot of Bede texts at the moment, and I kind of just became fascinated by the approach that historians take and have taken throughout the course of time. As you can tell, I have a very small YouTube channel, so any kind of support you can give me would be awesome. A comment, a like, a subscribe. I truly am grateful for how people have interacted with me so far. It's really heartwarming and really, really encouraging. So thank you. Have a wonderful day and Godspeed.